Our top story now, and the latest in the Middle East, where more hostages held by Hamas have been released as part of an agreed 4-day pause in fighting between Israeli forces and Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
17 hostages, including 9 kids, were released yesterday, including a 4-year-old Israeli-American girl, Abigail Iden. US President Joe Biden said he wants to see the pause in fighting go on as long as hostages keep getting released.
Well, joining us now is Conservative MP and former chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. Thank you so much for joining us, Tobias. Good morning. What chance do you think there is of a pause in fighting being extended?
You can hear the enormous international pressure that's being placed on both sides to continue this. We now have a process in place, a lot of back channels working behind the scenes. Qatar, we've heard of, Jordan's involved, along with Egypt, the Red Cross playing an important role as well. Now that we've got that system in place, there's a lot of pressure from President Biden, indeed our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, to say, let's continue this process. Bearing in mind, both sides have made it very clear their public intent to resume the fighting once this period of pause stops. And we need to recognize this is not a ceasefire. This is a humanitarian pause. The difference is really clear. The ceasefire introduces a third party, another force that keeps the contesting parties aside. That doesn't exist here. But as long as there is this pause, we can get more hostages out. And as important is getting humanitarian aid in. Over 1 million people are now carrying in United Nations places and schools and hospitals and so forth, reliant on international aid. So it's absolutely important that we keep this going. But big questions as to what happens next, not just the fighting itself, but this whole issue has raised questions about long-term governance, long-term security, long-term humanitarian support for the Gaza Strip and indeed the West Bank as well. That's where Britain, that's where America, other countries can play a role, the Arab states as well. Israel needs to recognize that this challenge, this problem that erupted on the 7th of October is part of a much bigger issue, but they are not alone in trying to solve this.
Very interesting, Tobias. And when we were talking last week on the show, all of us, about, this potential pause, and I was saying I didn't think it was a ceasefire. I'm interested in what you say. That brings in a third party. And, of course, everybody wants those hostages out. But then at the back end of last week, before it started, when we finished on Thursday, it was there'd be a delay on this side and they're giving 50 and they're giving 150. And so very, very delicate. I'm going to ask the unpopular question, but I am anyway. What would you say to the people who say that terrorists grabbed innocent people and held them hostage to use as make-weights in a debate, I guess, with the Israelis? The Palestinians who are in prison, I don't know. We were told they were women and children. The Israelis will say that they were people who had committed crimes. Are we going to get to a point where it's tit for tat? Because we're talking about human life, right?
We are talking about human life. You're absolutely right. We should not assume that those people that are in the Israeli prisons are innocent. Many of them, and I've seen pictures of them, are teenagers, adolescents that have actually stabbed the Israeli Defense Forces. They haven't been put into trial, so that's obviously another question there. But they've been arrested on, I think, on absolutely grounds that anybody would be concerned about. You cannot go around stabbing Israeli Defense Forces and then trying to run away. So obviously a lot of pressure here to get this right. I should just say that the value of each individual life from the Israeli perspective is something very, very extraordinary. More so, I would argue, than in the West itself. This duty of care to leave no one behind, given what the generations have experienced over millennia. It's in the Jewish mindset, an understandable consequence of their persecution, throughout our history itself. I should also say it's something very personal to the Prime Minister himself. There's been hostage taking by of Israelis throughout time. That big Air France flight in Uganda, it resulted in over 100 Israelis actually being liberated, being freed, with the terrorists being killed. Only one person was killed in that entire operation, and that was Benjamin Netanyahu's brother, Yonatan. He was the Israeli raid leader, the only casualty. So this is very personal to the Israeli Prime Minister on getting those hostages back.
And Tobias, we talk about the value of life there, which is so vitally important. What do you say to people who are watching events unfold in Gaza and say, you know, over 14,000 lives have been lost now, a mixture, obviously, of terrorists, members of Hamas, but also innocent civilians and children? What do you speak to the value of their lives?
You know, I'm really pleased that you're giving this time to discuss, because unfortunately in the debate, opinions have become too binary. You can support Israel's right to defend itself following those horrible, terrorist attacks, those barbaric attacks on the 7th of October, and more widely stand with the Jewish faith, as so many people did on the peaceful demonstration on the weekend, and stand up against the anti-Semitic attacks. But you can also be critical of Israel's current military tactics, as I've been done, and the absence of a clear long-term plan for Gaza, in the same way that you can support Palestinian voices in calling for a longer humanitarian pause, getting humanitarian aid in, and a longer-term approach to securing that two-state solution, but also be critical of those that gloss over what Hamas, a terrorist group, and indeed other terrorist groups have done persistently over the years against Israel. It's much more nuanced. And that's where, the quality of life comes into this, of where we're going in the longer term, why it's important that the international community helps define where this will go in the longer term. What's not clear at the moment is what replaces Hamas. They've lost any right to represent the Palestinian people, given their barbaric attacks on the 7th of October and prior to that, but also their long-term commitment to try and to eradicate the Israeli state. That is no position for anybody to say that they lead the Palestinian people. The question for the Palestinians, and indeed for all of us, is what is the governance structure that might come in to replace that? And that's where the Arab nations, I think, have a role to play in crafting a temporary, a transitional council, if you like, a technocratic capability that can step in and run the Gaza Strip in the interim. And that's the discussions, I think, that require nations to come together, something Britain could perhaps lean forward
Tobias,
on demilitarizing Gaza.
I have to say, yeah, really spot on, mate, and thank you. I know it always seems like 7 minutes goes so quickly, but really appreciate your time, my friend, and appreciate your comments this morning. Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP and former chair of the Defence Select Committee.